How's it going, folks? I'm Des with DesFit, and this is the Garmin Marq Gen 2 Athlete Edition. This watch takes what is already a very premium outdoor-focused sports watch, the Garmin Epix Gen 2, and elevates it to another level by using even more premium materials like grade 5 titanium and a domed sapphire lens, making it basically one of the most premium outdoor and sports-focused smartwatches on the market today. But not only that, the Marq series also allowed Garmin designers to get even more creative with specialty editions that represent some of Garmin's segments like aviation, boating, golf, outdoors with the Adventure Edition, and then sports and fitness with the Athlete Edition, which I'm covering for you here today. So I've already made a video about all the differences between all the different Marq Gen 2 editions, so if you haven't already watched that video, I'll have that video linked down in the description below, but this video is really all about the Athlete Edition and my long-term thoughts on this uber premium sports watch. This has been my daily driver over the last couple months, where I've used it to track all the sports I do, like running, biking, as well as weight training, but I also took it downhill skiing, cross-country skiing, as well as backcountry skiing. I used it to track all my health stats, including sleep and heart rate variability. Use it as a smartwatch, of course, but I even took it halfway across the world to test the new jet lag advisor feature that came out alongside the Marq Gen 2. The Marq series line of luxury sports watches is really all about super high-end materials, making what is already a very high-end watch even more special with materials like a grade 5 titanium case versus the polymer case that's found on the Epix Gen 2. The Epix Gen 2 is already a great-looking watch with a metal bezel and metal back, but having this all-metal construction on the Marq Gen 2 elevates it quite a bit, and they even went ahead and upgraded the buttons. It definitely stands out not only because of the entire case being made out of grade 5 titanium, but also a special bezel with very distinct markings. The grade 5 titanium is supposed to be 2.5 times more scratch resistant than the titanium found on the Epix Gen 2, and as you can see, it looks basically perfect after a couple months of use. However, I would also point out that my Epix also looks just like new. Either way, I don't think durability is an issue with either of these. Another upgrade with the Marq Gen 2 is that they all have a domed sapphire lens versus the flat sapphire lens on the Epix, and it adds a very nice touch to the Marq Gen 2 where the lens sort of appears to blend into the bezel and the case a bit more to create this kind of seamless look. The Marq Gen 2 also comes with a unique strap that's special to the Marq lineup, where they have an integrated type design where it very much takes on the shape of the rest of the watch, and it blends in really nicely. Now, all the Marq Gen 2s actually come with this silicone band. It's just that with the Athlete Edition, it's the only band that you get. With the other Marq Gen 2s, those also come with special bands for each of those different editions, but they also include this silicone band as an extra inside the box, so you can use this band for sports and workouts to reduce wear and tear on those specialty bands. And then for any of you that are curious, you can absolutely use other 22mm quick fit bands with the Marq Gen 2 if you'd like. So here I'm just popping off the quick fit band from the Epix and it fits right onto the Marq. However, it doesn't necessarily work the other way around. The Marq Gen 2 bands don't work on the Epix, just slightly off. Oh, and really quick, if you're finding the information in this video to be useful, do me a favor, just quickly hit that like button down below. It's a small little thing that you can do that'll help this video and the channel quite a bit, and I appreciate it. And then for dimensions and weight, the Marq Gen 2 shares very similar dimensions to the Epix, but it's just 1mm smaller in terms of the case size, and then it's just 0.5 millimeter thicker. I'm guessing that a portion of that 0.5 millimeter has to do with the domed sapphire lens, but in regards to wearability, I could barely tell a difference. The Marq Gen 2 also weighs just slightly more, coming in around 15 grams more than the Epix Gen 2, and most of the difference will be in the case itself, but there's also a little bit of difference with the straps. But again, in terms of wearability and usability, that 15 grams difference, I didn't really notice it. Now, when Garmin came out with the first gen Marks, those were based on the Fenix 6, where with the Marq Gen 2, these are based on the Epix Gen 2, which is essentially a Fenix 7 with an AMOLED display. Memory and pixel or transflective displays that are found on the Fenix 6 and the Fenix 7, they're great displays and all, where they don't consume much power, they work great in direct sunlight, but they're just not as bright and crispy as the AMOLED displays that are found on the Epix Gen 2 and the Marq Gen 2. And I think they made the right move by choosing AMOLED displays for the Marq Gen 2 versus transflective. It just kind of fits better with the style of this watch, and since you can still get anywhere from like 4 to 5 days all the way up to 2 weeks of battery life depending on your settings, it's still very good battery life for a watch with this kind of display. Now, one thing that's sort of interesting about the Marq Gen 2 is that the display is 1.2 inches versus 1.3 inches on the Epix. And I'm not sure of the exact reason for that slightly smaller display other than possibly making room for the domed sapphire lens, or maybe something to do with the different case or the different bezel. But again, this is something that basically made zero difference in terms of usability, where it's only noticeable if you were to compare these like side by side. But just like the Garmin Epix, the Marq Gen 2 has a touchscreen, it has a 5-button configuration, and what's nice about this combination is that you can kind of pick and choose how and where you want to use the touchscreen, where you can disable the touchscreen entirely if you'd like and just use buttons, you can use it for just the smartwatch day-to-day features, and then you can even enable or disable it for different sport profiles. And really, one of the best features of that touchscreen is being able to use it with the full-blown topo and landscape maps that come on the Marq Gen 2. And on that note, the Marq Gen 2 comes with 32 gigabytes of storage, just like the Epix Gen 2 Sapphire Edition. And the main use for all the storage will be for worldwide topo and landscape maps, where you can load nearly every single map region on the watch at one given time. And there's a map manager function that you can use on the watch itself to manage your maps, but if you're downloading new regions, I'd actually suggest that you just plug it into your computer and use Garmin Express to manage these, because downloading maps over Wi-Fi can kind of take a while. Using Garmin Express to download maps on your PC is a much faster process. And then for battery life, the Marq Gen 2 can get basically the same as the Epix, where you can get anywhere from 4 to 5 days all the way up to 2 weeks, depending on your settings and how many outdoor activities that you're going to track. If you have the always on display enabled and you tend to track a lot of outdoor activities, bank on closer to that 4 to 5 day mark. That's basically the mode I had it in over the course of my testing, and charging it every 4 to 5 days wasn't a big deal at all. But if you want to extend battery life, you can disable the always on display and just have the screen wake up with a quick flick of the wrist or with a tap or a button press. And at that point, you can get in the 10 to 14 days, depending again on your use. But one thing that is different with the Marq Gen 2 is that it uses a unique charging cable, where this is a USB Type-C cable that attaches via magnets versus the plug-in charger on the Epix. And one benefit to this charging cable is that it can charge the Marq Gen 2 from empty to full in about an hour versus the Epix, which took about 2 hours for me to charge from empty to full. The magnetic charging cable is awesome, by the way, and quite frankly, something I'd love to see on other Garmin watches. One drawback I did think about though is that since it is a more unique charging cable, that it may not be as convenient to purchase a spare cable if you happen to forget one on your trip or something like that. However, what I found nice is that even though it is a special charging cable that you have to use with the Marq Gen 2s, it's actually not any more expensive than a standard Garmin charging cable. And in addition, if for some reason you prefer USB Type-A, they also have that available, and Garmin said that should not affect the charging speeds. And then from a software feature standpoint, the Marq Gen 2 and the Epix Gen 2, as well as the Fenix 7, these are all nearly identical, where you get all the health tracking capabilities like 24/7 heart rate tracking, SpO2 or blood oxygen saturation tracking, sleep tracking, heart rate variability or HRV, training readiness, which helps you give you an idea of how ready you are for training based on your training history and recovery, the enormous list of sport profiles with everything under the sun from all the common activities like running, cycling, swimming, and gym profiles, along with tons of outdoor recreational profiles like paddleboarding, surfing, skiing, and just tons more. And then with the Aviator, the Captain, the Golfer, and the Adventure editions, those come with some specialty profiles just for those editions, which I have more details about those in my other video about the Marq Gen 2 editions. But one new feature that does come on all the Marq Gen 2s, which didn't originally come with the Epix or Fenix 7, is the new Jet Lag Advisor feature, which is designed to give you guidance on fighting the effects of jet lag with tips and tricks not only during your trip, but also leading up to and following your trip to help offset those time zone differences. And I actually got to test this feature out pretty intensively on a trip I did about a month or so ago from my home in Colorado all the way to the other end of the world in Malaysia. And I have to say that it was nice having some of those alerts, like when to avoid light, when to seek light, little bedtime reminders, and a whole bunch more. A lot of these tips and tricks should come naturally to those of you who are used to overseas travel, but even for myself, who has had quite a few overseas trips in recent years, they were just nice reminders to have on occasion. I actually have an incredibly in-depth video about how this feature worked on that 2-week trip, where I go through a chronicle of basically every day on that trip and what kind of guidance it provided, so go ahead and check out that video once you're done over here. And then on the sports and fitness tracking side of things, although the Marq Gen 2 comes with the same dual-band GPS chipset that's found on the Epix Gen 2 Sapphire editions as well as the Fenix 7 Sapphire editions, the case is also much different, which required Garmin to kind of rethink the intended design. The thing is, there's plenty of watches now that are coming with dual-band satellite chipsets, not only from Garmin, but from lots of other companies. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the accuracy is all created equal. The intended design actually has a lot to do with that, as we've seen some of the other dual-band tests that I've done in the past. But how did the Marq Gen 2 fare? Well, I've got some pretty good examples here in all sorts of environments, like out in the wide open, deep in the city, as well as out in the forest. So for example, here's a run that I did while I was in Malaysia, and this was a pretty good test because of a lot of the tall buildings around the area where I was running. And as you can see, the Marq Gen 2 was spot on with the other devices that I was using. And if we take a really up close look at the GPS tracks, as I started out, the Marq Gen 2 was right on the money, and I have the Mark II in orange, by the way. The Chorus Apex 2 Pro, that's in dark blue, that wandered slightly here, but all in all, not bad for all of them. As I started to get into some of the taller buildings down here by the highway, they were all pretty much in line with the actual sidewalk where I was running. And down here, you'll see that the device in purple, which is the Amazfit Falcon, started to wander a little bit, but the Marq Gen 2 was rock solid. Around this roundabout though, I kind of wanted to point out how the Forerunner 955 and the Marq Gen 2 were a bit more accurate in the actual path I took versus the Chorus Apex 2 Pro and the Amazfit Falcon. And that was basically the trend I saw over the course of this entire run, where the dual band chipsets on the Marq Gen 2 and the Forerunner 955 were just a bit more accurate than the other devices. And then for road biking, this was basically a ride all out in the wide open for the most part, and the Marq Gen 2 was basically identical to the other devices. And then for the finer detail of the GPS tracks, it was basically perfect over the course of the entire ride. On the straight sections, it held its line extremely well. On all the curved sections here, which are actually under a little bit of tree cover, it also tracked well. It's basically exactly what I wanted to see. And then here's an example for a mountain bike ride that I did back in Colorado, and as you can see, the total distance lined up nearly identical to the other devices I was using. And another thing I wanted to point out here is that the Marq Gen 2 did a very good job tracking the elevation gain compared to both the other devices, as well as Strava's corrected elevation figure that's based on their base maps. And then taking, again, a look at the finer detail of the GPS track, well, there's really not much to say other than the Marq Gen 2 was on the money for the entire ride. There's literally not one spot I could find where it had a hiccup. The only thing that you may notice is the track that's in purple, which is the Garmin Edge 830, which is the only device on this ride that doesn't have a dual band satellite chipset. And as you can see from the handful of corners here and there, it just kind of wanders a little bit. Nothing drastic, of course, but that's just where there's even higher accuracy with some devices with dual band satellite system technology. And then before we get into heart rate accuracy, I also wanted to really quick go over how well the Marq Gen 2 did at estimating distances running indoors on a treadmill. And quite frankly, it did a phenomenal job where it was nearly identical to the treadmill that I was using, which I found to be pretty accurate. And when it comes to heart rate accuracy, the Marq Gen 2 uses the exact same 4th generation Elevate heart rate sensor that's found on many of Garmin's latest fitness watches. But again, just like the GPS chipsets, that may not necessarily mean it's just as accurate. You see, with larger and heavier watches, what tends to happen is that these watches can kind of have a tendency of moving around the wrist, which is something that these sensors don't like. So to get the most accurate readings, a watch needs to be very secure on the wrist, not only to prevent the sensor from moving around, but also to prevent any possibility of light leaking in between the sensor and your skin. But spoiler alert, the Marq Gen 2 actually did great and performed very similar to many of the lighter Garmin watches I've tested with the same sensor. And I think a big reason for that is that even though the Marq Gen 2 does weigh a little bit more than some others, this watch band kind of makes a nice formation around the wrist, which keeps it nice and secure. So for example, here's an outdoor run, and as you can see, the Marq Gen 2 performed very well here compared to both a chest heart rate strap as well as an arm-based optical heart rate sensor. And in fact, we actually see a few blips from the arm-based optical heart rate sensor that we actually don't see with the Marq Gen 2. And then for indoor cycling, this is basically a perfect result from the Marq II. There were just a couple blips from it right at the beginning of the workout for maybe like the first 30 seconds or so, but that's kind of typical for a wrist-based optical heart rate sensor. And then after that, it was nearly identical to the external heart rate monitors I was using. Now, for a bit more challenging activity though, we should take it road biking outside. And what happens here is that you start to introduce more variables like vibrations and bumps in the road, which can kind of throw off these kind of sensors. But the Marq Gen 2 did very well here again. You'll certainly see more variance on an activity like this versus the ones I just went over, but for this kind of activity, this is a very respectable result. You'll see like on some of these quick changes in the heart rate, the Marq II was a few seconds behind the external heart rate monitors, but that's kind of typical. But after that, it tracked extremely well. The only thing that was a bit more amiss was this little blip right here, but as you can see, it did correct itself quickly. When it comes to weight training, however, this is by far one of the hardest activities for wrist-based optical heart rate sensors to track accurately due to a lot of the varying arm movement and plenty of wrist flexion, especially when you're gripping onto the dumbbells. But even so, this is actually a pretty respectable result from the Marq Gen 2 for weight training. You can see that it's not quite as responsive as a chest heart rate sensor, but again, this is just kind of the nature when it comes to accuracy from an optical heart rate sensor on a watch, and you can even see some variance from the arm-based optical heart rate sensor as well. But overall, this really isn't bad at all, and it's very usable. So from a performance and accuracy standpoint, the Marq Gen 2 performs really well, just like the Epix Gen 2 does for me, so there's really no complaints in that department. But I did want to wrap up this video by bringing up that there's sometimes some talk surrounding the Marq series line of watches as not something like a classical mechanical timepiece such as like a Rolex or something like that, that's designed to be passed down from generation to generation. And that's totally true, but I also don't think that's necessarily the point with the Marqs. These are for someone who wants all the functionality of the most capable sports watches in the world, but also wants something even more distinguished and something even more special that they can wear anywhere, not only for the sports that they do, but also for pretty much any other event or occasion that may come up. Of course, that does come at a cost, but these are really meant for people who do have the income to purchase such a timepiece. Anyhow, if you have any questions on the Marq Gen 2 that I didn't cover in this video, feel free to leave those in the comment section down below. And on your way down there, if you found the information in this video useful, do me a favor and hit that like button, and also subscribe to the channel for plenty more sports tech videos that are coming soon. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.